This meeting is being recorded.
Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening from wherever you might be joining us. And welcome to this webinar on boosting multilateral investment for biodiversity that is happening in the framework of the OECD's Multilateral Development Finance Week. This event is co-hosted by the OECD and E3G. And I would like to now introduce myself. My name is Laura Sabogal, and I'm a policy advisor at E3G, working on the alignment of public banks, which also, of course, include multilateral development banks, with the Paris Agreement. And today I'm joined by a stellar set of speakers who will share with us their insights on the challenges associated with the deployment of biodiversity and land use finance. However, before we start, I wanted to take a moment to highlight the importance of the topic we will be discussing today. Next slide, please. Yes, so here we will see the agenda. We will start with a brief introduction of me setting the scene. This will be followed by some input on the insights from E3G's Public Bank Climate Tracker Matrix, which also looks at biodiversity investments in the realm of public banks. This will be followed by some input from Johanna Riedman from the NAMA facility on lessons learned from the NAMA facility portfolio over the last almost 10 years. Followed by a presentation by Santiago Wulans from the New Climate Institute on development finance in the land sector, tracking progress towards Paris alignment, and really looking at a report that is really fresh off the press. It was just published yesterday, so very exciting and new input. And then finally, we will have some input by Dr. Helena Wright from FAIR Foundation on the role of investor action in global food systems and how this can help us address biodiversity risk. At the very end, once all of these speakers have provided their initial input, we will have some space for discussion. And finally, in case time allows it, we will gonna have space for a couple of questions. But of course, in case we don't get to all of those questions, please feel free to reach to all of the speakers. I'm sure everybody will be very happy to talk to you. Next slide, please. Before we start, I just wanted to take a moment to introduce E3G to the people that might not be aware of what E3G is. So E3G is an independent climate change think tank. Its mission is to accelerate the transition to a climate-safe world. We actually have offices in London, Brussels, Berlin, Dublin, and Washington, D.C., as well as associates around the world. We achieve this, or we strive to achieve this transition to a climate-safe world through delivering outcomes through coalition building with partners in governments, politics, NGOs, science, and media. We're funded primarily from philanthropic foundations, and E3G has been consistently ranked as one of the top environmental think tanks around the world. So with that, I would like to just jump to set the scene. So as we all know, yesterday, the other much less popular UN summit started in Montreal. Over the next 2 weeks, parties at COP15 will attempt to agree on a global biodiversity framework. Although this biodiversity COP happens every 2 years, this edition is especially important given that after 2 years delay due to the COVID pandemic, parties will attempt to agree on a global biodiversity framework to halt and reverse biodiversity loss up to 2030 and to set in motion an ambitious to a 2050 vision. This is particularly relevant because the previous strategic plan for biodiversity, which was comprised of the so-called Aichi targets, which were adopted in COP10, actually were not fulfilled. And of course, this brings us to the topic of biodiversity and the crisis that we're actually going through and why it's so relevant and why this webinar comes at a good moment. The relevance of biodiversity cannot be understated. All living beings on our planet depend on the complex web of interconnected and interdependent ecosystems that sustains all life on Earth. Essentially, biodiversity is Earth's life support, providing clean air, water, pollination, climate regulation. The list is endless. Unfortunately, we also know that over the last 15 years, there's been a decrease of almost 70% in wildlife populations globally. And we also know that biodiversity is currently going through the fastest decline ever in history, with more than 1 million species currently threatened by extinction. These great developments are driven by humankind in several ways. One of these leading causes is, of course, land use change, which we will discuss in a minute. In this way, the developments of COP15 will be crucial, and we are very happy to have this webinar whilst COP15 is happening in Montreal. Next slide, please. So what are the drivers of the biodiversity crisis? As I just mentioned, land use is only one of them, but according to the IPBES, there are 5 main biodiversity drivers, which include land and sea use change, overexploitation of natural resources, climate change, pollution, and invasive species. Today, besides speaking about biodiversity, we're also going to talk about land use change as one of the major drivers of biodiversity loss in terms of human influence, which of course can take the shape of conversion of land cover, so deforestation or mining, changes in the management of the ecosystem or agroecosystem, or changes in the spatial configuration of the landscape through fragmentation of habitats. This is especially relevant because as the global population grows, the pressure on ecosystems and nature and overall biodiversity will continue to increase due to additional demand on food, water, timber, energy, land, just to name a few examples. So it is urgent to address this biodiversity crisis, but also I would like to emphasize the need to address the so-called twin crisis, namely biodiversity loss and climate change, as these two are two sides of the same coin. And it's a two-way process. On the one hand, climate change is one of the main drivers of biodiversity loss, but destruction of ecosystem undermines nature's ability to regulate greenhouse gas emissions, and therefore protect us against extreme weather, thus accelerating climate change. Therefore, it's urgent that we address these two crises simultaneously and that we stop treating them in silos. Next slide, please. So I was just mentioning, we are currently facing this twin crisis, and it's this two-way process. This inextricable link between biodiversity and climate action and how they're actually related is gaining momentum. Proof of this is that at COP26 in Glasgow, world leaders signed a pledge for nature to reverse biodiversity loss and ecosystem degradation, in part because it recognizes that biodiversity loss is exacerbating climate change. Similarly, this year, and only less than a month ago, COP27's final agreement included a cover decision looking at the protection on oceans, forests, and agricultures. So we see that this discussion is gaining traction. However, there is still a large gap of financing, which is what brings us today here. Next slide, please. So with this background, it's now clear that hopefully what we will see at the end of COP15 in a couple of weeks will be the implementation, or at least the agreement on a global biodiversity framework. But to reach a successful implementation, we already know that ambitious financing will be required. This is particularly challenging because biodiversity finance receives even less finance than climate action in general. As such, we already know that based on OECD data from 2019, that approximately biodiversity finance in total it reaches somewhere around 78 to 91 billion per year, whilst the estimated required financing is approximately 700 billion, according to data from the Nature Conservancy. And this number, of course, varies, right? There are other estimates that are a little bit higher. So we see that the gap that needs to be bridged is actually quite significant. Next slide, please. So here, I would like to now focus on the specific set of financiers that we would like to discuss and their relation to biodiversity finance, namely the role of multilateral financiers and, of course, the overall financial sector. So we also know that vast public and private financial flows are still being targeted at activities that have a negative impact on biodiversity. These instruments are considerably larger than those going to the protection of biodiversity. So on the one hand, we have a gap that we need to bridge in terms of the increase of the investment of nature positive activities, but also we need to do some work so that multilateral financiers reallocate funds that are currently going to potentially damaging activities to biodiversity. Another important figure that I would like to share with you, and then I will stop with all the figures and all the numbers, is that according to the OECD's most recent multilateral development finance report that was published this year, and that is actually the reason why we're here, currently multilateral financiers are investing 3.1 billion in biodiversity related activities. This figure remains a mere fraction of the 500 billion which governments are spending annually to support potentially harmful activities to biodiversity. Next slide, please. So what is the role of multilateral finance, and how can multilateral actors how can they step up their commitment and their pledges and of course their financing to benefit biodiversity and to help halt and reverse this crisis? So the first thing is that and this has actually been progressively been more mainstreamed in the last 5 years, I would say, is that financial institutions, including multilateral financiers, rely extensively on the service and resources provided by nature. So this key piece, I think it's now becoming more prominent in the fact that a lot of banks are now including biodiversity risk in their financial risk assessments. The second point that I would like to bring to your attention is that public banks, which include also multilateral development banks, but also bilateral development finance institutions, as well as every source of public finance, mobilize approximately 10% of the world's global financial flows. And this doesn't even cover the amount of money that they can leverage, right? So definitely it's not an insignificant portion of the mosaic of financing flows that we need to pull together to reach and bridge this gap of biodiversity finance. And the other positive news that I would also like to bring to your attention is that according to the OECD, in the past decade, there has been a remarkable growth in multilateral finance. So the discussion is gaining momentum. There is more finance definitely being allocated to positive biodiversity related activities, all the way up to 325% increase. However, there are still persistent bottlenecks constraining effective resource deployment. And this is why I'm very excited to be here to talk to other speakers about this and to hear their experiences with this topic and to hear the insights that they want to share with us. In this way, I want to highlight that the potential contributions of multilateral financiers extends beyond financing and includes their policy thought leadership and their ability to convene private and public stakeholders. So just to sum up, it's not only the amount of finance that they can leverage and also mobilize, but also the amount of the support that they can provide to countries in the development of their NDCs, nationally determined contribution, long-term strategies, as well as all sorts of other plans and policies that can really help reallocate money, but also incentives. So with this, I will step very briefly out of my moderator role, and I will just share a couple of very brief insights from E3G's Public Bank Climate Tracker Matrix. Next slide, please. So E3G's, just as a short introduction, E3G's Public Bank Climate Tracker Matrix is a tool that seeks to make transparent how MDBs as well as other public banks are or are not mainstreaming climate change in their work. It is first and foremost a communication and engagement tool. And with this tool, we have already assessed over 15 financial institution, including all the largest MDBs or multilateral development banks, such as the World Bank, African Development Bank, so all of them. But today, I am not really here to go into in depth about like the results of these assessments. I would rather invite you to take a look if you're interested to see how banks are faring, because we also in this tool, we look at different metrics, 15 to be exact, and one of them relates to nature-based solutions. Next slide, please. So this tool, basically the background of how E3G came up with this tool. This tool further breaks down the different building blocks or pillars identified by different multilateral banks, such as, for example, the Joint MDB, or bilateral groups, such as, for example, the International Development Finance Club or the European Development Finance Institution. So as you can see at the very left, you see all the different building blocks and pillars that these groups have defined on their path to Paris alignment. And at the very right, you can see the metrics that E3G came up with that are a little bit more granular and that specifically look at, for example, in this case, relevant to our discussion today, nature-based solutions. Next slide, please. So here you will see that in this tool, basically what we do is that we benchmark, and basically we have for every metric different levels that a bank can be categorized with according to their performance. So here we will not go into detail, but this is just to show you for each of these different categories that banks can be ranked with or categorized with, that rank from unaligned to transformational. We have defined benchmarks of what needs to happen. Next slide, please. So with this, and that was just as a form of introduction in case that you're curious and would like to check out those assessments, I would like to focus on two specific insights before I give the word to other speakers. And the first one is that accounting for biodiversity finance remains a challenge as there is no uniform methodology. And this really creates an issue in terms of tracking those financial flows. The second part, again, is highlighting that this discussion is gaining momentum as proven by the joint MDB nature statement announced at COP26 and by the decision that I mentioned beforehand in COP27 to actually include a provision in the cover text. And finally, I would like to highlight two specific examples of a multilateral development bank that is actually leading this movement, amongst others, of course. That multilateral bank is the Inter-American Development Bank, which through the promotion of innovative financial mechanisms, it's really shaping and fostering this discussion amongst the MDBs. Other noteworthy best practices of the IDB also include the launch of a new natural capital asset class in the New York Stock Exchange. And finally, another actor that I would also like to highlight from our assessments with the E3G Public Bank Climate Tracker Matrix, that although is not a multilateral financier, but rather a bilateral development financial institution, is the French Development Agency, which is also leading the mainstreaming of biodiversity finance through its support of a global standard of nature-based solutions and through its work on the task force on nature-related financial disclosures. And with this, my input is now over. I would now like to give the word to Santiago Bulan, Johanna Riedman from the NAMA facility, who will kindly share with us some insights from the NAMA facility portfolio. Johanna, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you so much, Laura, and welcome everyone. So yeah, I'm Johanna Riedman. I'm from the NAMA facility, and I'm also the sector lead at the NAMA facility for agriculture, forestry, and land use projects. And we did actually conduct an analysis on the sector in comparison to other sectors and what we see in our portfolio. But before I present some learnings from that analysis, I will also share just shortly with you who is actually NAMA facility, so you understand the context a little bit. So NAMA facility does implement NAMA support projects as the most ambitious part of the NAMA or NDC. So we've been around since 2012, so quite a while, and of course by now focusing more on NDCs. And really important to know is that we provide funding for a combination of financial and technical measures. So also really look into financial mechanisms and driving transformation in sectors. And we select projects in bidding rounds. And just some key requirements for our project selection would be implementation readiness, how ready is a project for implementation, mitigation potential, of course, we do focus on mitigation, and transformational change, including also financial mechanisms. And with that, I would also like to give you a little bit of an input on how our sectors look like and where we actually do engage. So we can see that actually on the next slide. And there you can see that we have overall 43 projects in the portfolio right now, and we do address various sectors, among them also AFOLU. And we engage in transformational and developing countries, as you can see here in Latin America, Africa, Asia, and the Pacific. And here you can see that we have a few projects in the AFOLU sector already active. They focus on, for example, sustainable and carbon neutral development for coffee and or rice production or olive production. And as you can see, we have a few sectors present, and what we actually also try to understand in our portfolio is a little bit on how those sectors also fare and what kind of learnings we can get from all this data that we get from all those projects. And for that, I will present some of the learnings of an analysis that we conducted, which was actually looking into the outlines of projects that are submitted to NAMA facility between 2013 and 2021. And there we can see some findings actually on the next slide. And those outlines were overall about 450 outlines and that we looked into. They come from various sectors, and we did actually analyze a little bit on how they score on the various scoring points that we have in NAMA facility. And one of them is also financial ambition average, of course, and how far they can leverage finance from public and private actors. And that sub-criteria, you can actually see it here on the left side, a little small green bar. And there you can see that AFOLU, in comparison to the other sectors that are actually presented on the slide, namely energy, transport, and waste, is faring not as good on average, of course, within all those outlines that we analyzed quantitatively. And of course, we also wanted to understand a little bit more where is this coming from and what can we learn from it. And so we also conducted a bit of a qualitative analysis looking into all these outlines. And there we can see some observations from this analysis on the next slide. And so one point that we've seen in many outlines from the sector were that we see rather complex and lengthy timelines. This is often because we see various level of governance represented, and also sometimes various geographic regions represented, which makes a lot of sense because often various levels of governance are actually required to understand all the complex setups that we see in the field of land use. Also, that is related to seeing multiple intervention approaches within the portfolio, which also makes the setup, of course, rather complex and broad. And also related to that is, of course, we see a huge number of stakeholders relevant in those projects. And for that, of course, we do also see participatory approaches, which are absolutely crucial in that context, but which also mean that decision-making processes are lengthy, of course, because all opinions need to be heard and taken into account. And also in terms of timelines, what we see in the sector, especially if you're looking at smallholders, maybe this also to mention that most of the projects we focus on are rather looking at semi-commercial and commercial smallholders as a segment. And here we often, of course, see irregularities in revenues, and also really important alignment to production cycles, to growth cycles of the produce. Often needed are also pilots in order to achieve behavioral change for farmers. And again, in terms of timelines, participatory approach is really important, securing the buy-in of all stakeholders. So as you can see, overall, timelines and the setup is often rather complex and also means quite a long time to engage in the sector. And I also wanted to share a few other observations that we can see from those projects. If we go to the next slide, exactly, thank you. And for example, also the sustainability of the interventions. So of course, safeguards are absolutely crucial here, and are often also can be a bit of a barrier for funding, meaning that of course we need to look into governance, social, and of course also environmental safeguards. And often we see issues such as land titles, and of course also governance in the sense of enforcement. While we often see good regulations, they don't always are accountable in enforcement as well, related to coherent monitoring systems, etc. So also this is something that really poses challenges in the sector to address as well. And also related to sustainability, of course, certification processes, labeling processes, and setting up certification to ensure that the produce is also marked as being sustainable, and also that of course can take quite some time. Some other challenges I also wanted to share, which might be interesting for this group, are that especially in smallholder settings, what we see is often, of course, data is also sometimes not always reliable, sometimes also difficult to come by with. And another learning that we had was that, especially if we look at topics like mitigation, and I think it's actually also quite similar to topics like biodiversity for farmers, sometimes it's a little less easy to see for them, because tangible results are of course easy to see, such as adaptation, which would increase the resilience of plants, and hence increase the resilience of yield. And that actually leads us also to the next topic here, which is behavioral change, which is extremely important in those type of interventions. And in order to convince the stakeholders that those interventions are important, behavioral change is of crucial relevance. And for that, often we need trainings, we need quite extensive awareness raising campaigns in order to achieve behavioral change here as well. And there were also some learnings that we wanted to share on financial mechanism, which would be on the next slide. Thank you. And just also some observations that we have in the portfolio on which we also see maybe a bit challenging as well, would be, for example, the outreach of banks in rural areas can be problematic in some contexts. So sometimes we also see informal financial service providers that do play a role. That also leads a bit to the next point here, like financial illiteracy and a lack of trust towards financial institutions by small-scale holders. Also sometimes related to the fact that sometimes they're also not that present in certain, especially like marginalized areas. We also often see a high reliance on subsidized finance, such as grants, at least in our portfolio, which of course makes it more difficult to reach scalability and replication. Another point that we sometimes observe is a certain lack of liquidity in the sector. Of course, again, rather talking about small-scale farmers here, and which obviously also leads to lower impact in the sense of private sector leverage and makes it harder. Some other learnings that we also had, which might be interesting, is that, of course, a lot of the interventions that we talk about for farmers are rather like side products. So it's not the main business that they focus on, but it's rather an on-top business that they also engage in. Again, this is related to behavioral change, and also understanding that to make it really attractive for them to invest and engage. And which leads me to the last point here, which would be, again, revenue streams, often irregular depending on the type of farmer that we're talking about. And often, of course, huge risk, like especially yield risk in the sense of related to weather events and changing climate patterns, which is, of course, with the current developments more increasing. And which is also overall reinforcing the unbankable cycle that we sometimes see or fear to see in the sector. And yeah, those were some learnings that we wanted to share. So also for your interest, we also published a paper on those learnings. If there's an interest, and we'll share it with you later on. after the session, and so much from the NAMA facility. In case you have any questions or there's any like further knowledge you would like to have on this topic, please reach out. You can also find us on LinkedIn, on Twitter, etc. And yeah, thank you so much. And with that, I would give the word back to our moderator, Laura.
Thank you so much, Johanna, for also bringing the perspective of the implementation and once again highlighting the role of agricultural systems, food production, and the impact that has on biodiversity, and how we need to optimize and change certain patterns in order to reverse and halt the biodiversity crisis. So with this, I would like to introduce our second speaker, Santiago Wullans, policy analyst at New Climate Institute, who will, like I mentioned before, share with us insights of this freshly published report on development finance in the land sector, and how are these banks moving forward in terms of their investments in this sector. So, Santiago, the word is yours.
Thank you, Laura. Yeah, so basically, as you said, I'll be talking about development finance, and I just wanted to, before starting, kind of put this a bit into context, why we are doing this research. And I think also it threads nicely with your remarks on the E3G climate matrix. It's a long name. And just to mention that we are doing this in the context of the banks, the development banks coming out with these principles for Paris alignment coming up, and then following with this framework for the implementation of these principles in mitigation and adaptation. And then, so what we were wondering is what is happening in the land sector in this development finance space, and to what extent, or what is the situation there, and who has started to make changes or to talk about Paris alignment in the land sector. And what we look at is 3 different levels. Basically, we talk about sectoral strategies, we talk about country strategies, and we talk about projects. But first, when looking at sectoral strategies, what we were focusing on is to see what is the role of mitigation in these strategies, and to what extent are we talking about Paris alignment in the land sector, and also if we can see this idea of the need to transition, the urgent need to transition in the land sector. And what we found is that mitigation is a concern, a clear identified concern for the land sector strategies of most big development institutions. But it's not clearly defined in terms of what needs to be done and what can be done by the banks, and how sufficient the options are to reach those goals. What we found also some good examples and some progress by some banks who are already, for example, recognizing the problematic role of livestock farming, the need or the influence of diets in the land sector emissions. For example, as well, the need to integrate sectoral perspectives into country strategies better, to coordinate among lending branches, to expand the use of financial instruments such as policy-based lending, guarantees, and others. But also on the other side, what we found is that the focus is overwhelmingly on efficiency when talking about mitigation in the land sector. It's seen mostly as a positive side effect of developing the sector economically. And we're not seeing really yet this idea of the needed transformation of the sector and a focus on absolute emissions. We are not seeing a pathway or ideas or tools in this line to give us a vision of where the sector needs to be in line with Paris goals. And we also tracked the use of indicators along lines of forestry, agricultural production, and demand-related emissions, and to see to which extent banks are considering this. And we found a mixed bag there. We see the use of some indicators, but these are not really mainstreamed or widely considered. Next slide, please. So going into the next level, what we did was select 3 countries for case studies, and our goal with the selection was to have a diverse picture our countries are Argentina, Egypt, and Vietnam. And we wanted to have geographical diversity, but also different land sector profiles, different challenges, also different MDBs and other DFIs working together with the countries just to get the most diverse picture possible and not have 3 case studies that look very similar in the end. So when looking at country strategies, what we found was really a lack of sectoral focus in general, that these strategies are mostly focusing on macroeconomic issues, on the biggest challenges for the countries, and don't really go into detail into what can be done at the sectoral level. We found also some good developments, and especially this country climate and development reports, the CCDRs developed by the World Bank now in the second half of 2022, and assuming more incoming next year. And there we found this is a really good opportunity to really come up with this vision of what countries need to do for us to reach Paris goal collectively, and what can be done at the sectoral level. And what we found, in at least in our case studies, was that there is some progress in developing these pathways, these long-term visions for sectors, but unfortunately this didn't really make it to the land sector. Here I think we still haven't seen this more clear vision and something that allows us to assess the sufficiency of proposed measures and to understand the order of magnitude of the change needed, also in specific country contexts. What we found was that we also found other positive tools. For example, the climate smart agriculture country profiles from the World Bank. I thought this is also a good initiative, and it could be a useful input for many different organizations when tracking what is happening at the country level in terms of the implementation of certain measures, and also tracking country level indicators to understand the situation on the ground and to really make better decisions in terms of what needs financing and how much. However, yeah, we haven't seen this really making its way into country strategies just yet. Next slide, please. When looking at the projects, we analyzed what MDBs and other DFIs have been doing in these 3 countries in the land sector since 2015 until now. And we found over half of the finance provided by MDBs and other DFIs in this area would have substantial risk of undermining the Paris Agreement goals. And when looking a bit more into detail, what we found was 2 types of major risks. The first one is related to the supply chain of clients. That is, when finance is provided to a company that is, because of that finance, sourcing or producing more of a commodity that is associated with deforestation, and without sufficient requirements or to provide a credible proof of origin for the commodities and to really root out deforestation of the supply chains. Then the second type of risks that we also identified are related to working capital loans to diversified companies, and especially to companies that have operations either in deforestation risk areas or in very GHG intensive activities, and without a clear plan to first to measure these emissions, to measure the emissions impact of the financing, and to address it. So what we've seen is, or what we mean here with the risk is not that these projects necessarily shouldn't be financed, but rather that we need a better understanding of the impact of these projects in the sector. And this can be done by developing better safeguards and more requirements and better tracking, especially for big businesses. And this is where we mostly found these risks. Please, next slide. So we came up with a small list of things that need improvement and some recommendations for upcoming strategies and for upcoming developments in most DFIs. And what I think our first point and our most important point is we need to really acknowledge this urgent need to transition in the land sector, how important it is that we start thinking about it now and not leave it for last. And in that line, also to develop tools to understand the impact or the order of magnitude of the change needed and where the sector needs to go and what do we need to do to get there, and then understanding what can banks do to support it. And in that line, what we would like to see is that these tools and these ideas kind of make their way down to country strategies and to project approval and screening processes and to tracking. We thought also in more concrete terms, we should as well abandon this idea or this exclusive focus on efficiency as a mitigation strategy for the land sector. I mean, it's not that we shouldn't do it, but it shouldn't be the only thing we're doing. And we should be tracking absolute emission levels. We should be understanding the potential impact of different alternatives. And we should do this in the context of a plan to get us where we need to be. In that line, also, we came up with a few additional screening criteria for different economic activities, which I won't go into detail right now, but if you are interested, we will share the link to the report later. But that includes as well some supporting transformative options in the sector, for example, targeting alternative protein value chains, which was just one of the things we proposed. Then finally, what we also wanted to see is, or more on a operational level, what we thought is a good or could be potentially very beneficial is a wider integration of these ideas and these strategies into different lending branches, into different sectors, and into basically ideally also a common view among different MDBs, that this implementation of the Paris alignment strategies reaches or is uniform across different organizations so that we avoid one undermining the other. And with that, I leave it at that, let's say. I want to take more time and give the floor back to you, Laura.
Thank you so much, Santiago, and thank you also for bringing the perspective of larger businesses. I think Johanna did a great job explaining the issues of financing of smallholder farmers, but also the need to start transitioning and allocating finance that is going towards detrimental activities to biodiversity, to sustainable systems, right? And you mentioned one that is quite important right now, and with this, I think it's a great connection to our next and last speaker, which is Dr. Helena Wright, Head of Policy at FAIR, who will share with us insights of the work of FAIR with regard to global food systems and the relation to addressing biodiversity risks. So with this, the floor is yours, Helena.
Hi. Great to meet you all. Hi, I'm Helena Wright. I'm the Policy Director at FAIR, and we're an investor network focused on the global food system with a particular focus on the protein sector. So I'm going to provide a slightly different perspective here, which is a kind of private sector perspective, from the perspective of how institutional investors can actually engage in a more sustainable food system, and what the learnings might be also from that for the development banks as well. So yeah, next slide, please. Yeah, so just a brief background to FAIR and our work here. We are an ESG investor network focused on the food system, as I mentioned, launched around 7 years ago. And since then, we've had a really rapid increase in the number of institutional investor members of our network, as you can see in this chart. Next slide, please. So our investor members are located all around the world. We have some in North America and Europe, as well as a range of members from Asia and other countries, which we're hoping to grow more membership globally as well. And this kind of in a way reflects the ESG landscape in terms of investors that are focused in the ESG space. Next slide, please. So our work helps to shine a light on what are considered the most material investment risks in the global food system. And just to touch on some of those top level statistics here, you might be familiar with some of these, but when it comes to intensive livestock production in particular, that's responsible for 14.5% of global emissions, around a third of freshwater use, and it's also the leading cause of deforestation globally, as well as responsible for around 75% of Amazon deforestation, and consumes 70% of antibiotics as well. And a lot of these risks are obviously linked to biodiversity, namely water, deforestation and biodiversity loss, and waste and pollution as well. Next slide, please. So we also look at some of the economic and social impacts related to particularly protein production. Antibiotic resistance is obviously a leading risk, which has links to biodiversity loss as well in terms of how it harms the soil, and a range of other risks, which I won't go into here, which are more related to health and achievement of the SDGs. Next slide, please. And our research shows that intensifying the livestock production systems actually poses a risk to food security as well as a risk to biodiversity. Around 80% of all agricultural land is used for animal grazing and animal feed production, as you know, so that's a really high land use footprint. And around a third of all drinkable water is used for animal production. Next slide, please. So within our network, the investors are actually engaging in food companies in the global food system, and they have really global supply chains. So on the left-hand side of this chart, for example, you can see some of the largest protein producers, and on the right-hand side, you can see how they are supplying some of the major global retailers that we're familiar with in terms of supermarket chains and so on. Next slide, please. And our protein producer index looks at the largest 60 protein producer companies, so that's meat, dairy and aquaculture companies, and it covers the range of ESG risks that I just mentioned. A lot of those are considered high risk when it comes to deforestation and biodiversity, for example, and water use, waste and pollution. So in fact, some of these biodiversity related variables are the worst performing in the index. And I think that reflects really the kind of lack of action that we've seen on biodiversity compared to other ESG risks, and probably also the lack of regulation as well. Next slide, please. And you can see from this chart, for example, that 75% of companies in the index were ranked as high risk on biodiversity and deforestation. Many of those companies on the right-hand side actually have no disclosure on biodiversity or deforestation risk factors at all. So they don't disclose whether they have any targets relating to deforestation or whether they have any traceability of their supply chain. And that really reflects, obviously, that this is a low performing indicator. And this is quite relevant for development banks as well, as some of these companies have received sort of investments from development banks as well through the private sector arms. Next slide, please. So again, just to break down the data in a bit more detail, in terms of the biodiversity related indicators within the index, you can see deforestation and biodiversity, water use and scarcity, and waste and pollution were very low performing. You can see that aquaculture companies are actually performing much better in some of these indicators when it comes to disclosure than the other companies. That's kind of on average. And beef companies as well also perform slightly better when it comes to deforestation and biodiversity. That may reflect sort of attention on those companies in terms of more sort of demand for data and more visibility of what they're doing on deforestation. Next slide, please. Just to go on to a slightly different kind of nature-related factor, on the positive side of things, we have seen a lot of private investment flowing towards sustainable protein and plant-based food production. That's quite an interesting area which a lot of private sector investors are engaging in to reduce climate emissions, but also to reduce biodiversity impacts. And some of the largest companies within the sector are also diversifying into plant-based protein production as well, as a new way to produce food which can lower the impact on the environment. Just to share a statistic on this, it was found that if we diversify around 20% of beef consumption into microbial protein globally, we could halve deforestation, which is a very interesting statistic. And you can see from this graph how those private sector investments are increasing. Next slide, please. And the government interest also is increasing. According to our research, a lot of governments are also investing in alternative protein sources. This is based on some research based on public data. So Canada, Singapore, Denmark, amongst the countries that are investing in this sector, as a kind of example of a nature positive and quite transformational investment, which can transform the food system. So this could be something for development banks as well to look at. We know that most of this work is happening in the global north at present, but there is a potential for kind of global impacts of this transformation in the food sector to have positive biodiversity benefits as well, and positive development benefits. Next slide, please. So finally, just to touch on the work that we're doing at FAIR, it's clear that investors do need policymakers to act on food system risks. They can't manage these risks alone. And I think that's reflected in the data as well in terms of the lack of disclosure. There is a need for kind of more disclosure across the board on biodiversity risks, because investors just calling for that disclosure alone won't sort of manage those risks effectively. So some of our investor members also are engaging with policy. As an example, on the right-hand side here, you can see a group of our investor members called on the EU to align agricultural subsidies better with climate and nature goals. And also you can consider that development bank finance is an example of a subsidy as well. So there's also a kind of parallel need for development banks to align better their public funding with both climate and nature goals. And that is actually in line with the global biodiversity framework. Obviously, we've got COP15 taking place next week in Montreal. And the target 18 of that agreement calls for the better alignment of public finance with biodiversity goals as well. So a lot of investors are really interested in seeing that taking place. And yeah, look forward to discussing this more on the panel. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Helena, also for so clearly outlining the relationship between food systems and the risks that it represents for biodiversity. With this, I would like to take, we don't have a lot of time left, and I will not try to sum up all the input that all of the speakers have provided, but perhaps we can go a little bit more in depth in some of the topics that you have raised. And maybe I will start with you, Helena, just because you were just speaking, and because of your comment about like the need for policymakers to act on the modification of incentives, and also because you highlighted the point that development finance is also one of those subsidies. So to you, I would ask, what is the role of public finance in mainstreaming of biodiversity and land use considerations to prevent the lock-in of emissions and mitigation of climate risk? So how do you see this twin crisis? How can it be addressed through public finance?
Yeah, so I think touching on the role of public and private working together, I think there's clearly a need for more blended finance instruments where public finance can leverage and de-risk nature positive investments. And there's also the parallel need for sort of the high level governance of nature and biodiversity risk to be integrated within public finance institutions as well. And perhaps public and private sector can work together on that as well, sort of looking at what types of safeguards there are, say for deforestation risk, and applying those at public finance institutions as well, learning from what private finance institutions are doing. So yeah, that's just a quick example, but I think there's a huge opportunity to work together in many different ways on this area, because we're really just starting to understand those risks and address them.
Yes, definitely. And now that you mentioned blended finance, I would like to direct my next question to Johanna, who of course works at the NAMA facility, which aims to foster blended finance and the transformation of sectors through these blended finance instruments. So Johanna, you went a little bit in depth on the challenges that you found over the years. In terms of the positive developments and how over time the deployment of blended finance for the folio sector, for the agriculture, forestry, and other land use sector has evolved. Could you share with us some insights about those?
Yeah, thank you, Laura. And very interesting input, Helen. And yeah, so what we actually see in the portfolios, of course, that as mentioned before, we actually see a lot of highly subsidized finance in the sector, really, and a lot of grants. And it's always like also the question in how far demand-oriented products can also develop in the sector. As mentioned, there are actually a lot of challenges towards that as well. And of course, those challenges can be in the area of, as mentioned before, that for banks, for example, it's like the monitoring and the assessing even of the clients in that sector is actually quite costly and also time intense. And another point that was also mentioned is, of course, that we need to look into like in how far safeguards are actually being kept and being checked as well. And safeguards on paper on the one hand, and on safeguards in reality on the other hand as well. So also like really the enforcement of that is something that we really see as being very, very crucial on that. Yeah, thank you.
Yes, thank you for that. And actually, I'm seeing that we're getting some questions. One of those questions refers to the role of indigenous people and local communities in the protection of biodiversity and natural carbon sinks. And this made me think of your remarks, Johanna, of the need to coordinate stakeholders, the need for behavioral interventions, and the need to really bring all of these groups to a table. So thank you for sharing those. For the people that are currently now delivering questions, I will make sure to say those now, because we don't have so much time. There is one specific question that I think will be easiest to answer in the remaining 3 minutes. However, I do invite you to please get in touch with all of our amazing speakers. They will be very happy to talk to you. And this question goes to Helena. So what ESG biodiversity risks are you seeing from the increasing quote unquote fake meat sector?
Yeah, happy to briefly speak to that. I think there's kind of an interesting point on this, which is that obviously a lot of those products do use a lot less resources when it comes to land, when it comes to emissions, inputs such as fertilizers, pesticides, often a lot lower for those because of the way that they're produced. So in general, a lot of the research shows that the diversification into alternative or plant-based proteins has really positive biodiversity impacts. But I think we definitely need more and better disclosure of the risks in those companies, because a lot of them are new, they're startups, there's a lot of new products coming out. So we did release a recent framework on that to make sure that really the newer and novel products are really hitting a high bar when it comes to ESG. There's maybe a little bit of a parallel with, say, for example, when renewable energy sector started and sort of wind turbines had some potential negative impacts on, say, bird life, etc. So I think there's a real, with emerging sectors, there's a need to really ensure that they do meet all of the ESG criteria that we're looking for.
Yes, thank you for that. And in terms of the safeguards, it's also something that Santiago was highlighting about the relevance, and also of course Johanna and Helena across all of the presentations. This topic came up, the importance of establishing safeguards that not only look at the environmental aspect but also at the social aspects. And with that, unfortunately, we don't have any more time to keep discussing, but I would like to thank all of you on behalf of E3G for joining us. Of course, to our amazing, stellar set of speakers. Thank you so much for sharing your insights. I also wanted to let you know that we will be circulating a readout of this session as well as uploading this recording to our website. So we will be in touch with all of you. And of course, we will also include the links to the different reports that our panelists have been mentioning. In the meantime, thanks a lot, everybody, for joining us, and hope to talk to you soon. Bye-bye.